Every once in a while, we experience a time where we get the impression, at least, that we're being set up to fail. I don't know if that's happened to you, but it's happened to me a number of times. And I can remember one situation, one circumstance where I was traveling in a car with some friends of mine, and they asked me this question about what I thought about this newly designed logo. And my honest reaction was I didn't like it. It made no sense to me. I didn't understand the colors. I didn't understand the pattern. I'm not a graphic designer, but I was very frank in my disapproval of this logo. And then the car gets quiet, which means somebody in the car designed the logo. In which there's no backtracking. I felt set up in a sense. And then to looking back, I would have appreciated the conversation. Hey, I designed this new logo. What do you think about it? And then I can be a little bit more tempered in my response. But anyways, I was very vocal about my disapproval of it. And that's happened to me a number of times, and I'm sure it's happened to you as well. In the Looney Tunes classic Space Jam, we are brought to a place also where the 5 aliens that are trying to capture the Looney Tunes to take them back to their planet to be in their amusement park, to make their amusement park less lame. And during this encounter, we get the impression that the Looney Tunes are trying to set these aliens up to fail as well, as they say that they are to be given a chance to defend themselves. So let's watch this encounter. So in that movie, the Looney Tunes had an opportunity to try to give themselves a chance to defend themselves, and they tried to set up the aliens in a way that would set the Looney Tunes up to succeed and the aliens to fail. Now, if you've seen the movie, you know that they end up stealing the power from the NBA players like Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, and we end up with a basketball game with more drama and excitement that would put the Final Four to shame. And similarly to the Looney Tunes, trying to set up the aliens by challenging them to a contest that they perceive would cause them to fail, Jesus had a similar encounter, similar circumstance that we read about in the Gospel of Luke, where the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they tried to set Jesus up to fail. We read about this account in Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 6. This can be found on page 1034 in the church Bibles. So Luke 14, and we're going to start by just reading verses 1 and 2. And it says this: One Sabbath day, Jesus was in the home of a leader of the Pharisees. The people were watching him closely, because there was a man there whose arms and legs were swollen. Jesus was invited to the home of a leader of the Pharisees, and we get the impression that at least the author of this gospel, Luke, perceived that it was a setup. Luke says that the people were watching him closely. I often wonder why Jesus was there. Prior to this meeting, there had been some conflict with Jesus and the Pharisees. We read about a number of circumstances within the Gospels where Jesus and the Pharisees did not get along. One of those circumstances would be Luke chapter 11, verses 37 to 54. And during this passage of Scripture, Jesus repeatedly calls out the Pharisees. And he says, "How terrible it will be for you Pharisees." And he says that repeatedly throughout this encounter. And then this ends in Luke 11, 53 to 54, and it says, As Jesus finished speaking, the Pharisees and teachers of religious law were furious. From that time on, they grilled him with many hostile questions, trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. And here we are a few chapters later in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is having a meal with the Pharisees. We aren't sure exactly why Jesus is there, although some feel that he was invited as a visiting rabbi. And the custom in the day would have been to have Jesus, the visiting rabbi, at the principal Sabbath meal following the service of worship in the synagogue. So we don't know why Jesus was there. We know that he was, and we know that they're watching him closely. Verse 2 says that there was a man there whose arms and legs were swollen, or also translated and traditionally thought to have had dropsy. What is dropsy? Few people have heard of that. It's an old term for swelling of soft tissue due to the accumulation of excess water. So in years gone by, a person might have been said to have had dropsy. Today, one would be more descriptive and specify the cause. So this person might have edema due to congestive heart failure, and the symptoms of that would be the swollen arms and legs. So there's a man with dropsy, and they're watching Jesus very closely. Why are they watching Jesus closely? Because there have been a number of circumstances where Jesus had violated the Sabbath before. In the Gospel of Luke, prior to this encounter, there are 3 accounts where Jesus violated the Sabbath prior to this. In Luke chapter 4, verse 31 to 41, he casts a demon out of Simon Peter's mother. And in Luke 6, verses 6 to 11, he healed a man with a withered hand. And right before this, in Luke 13, 10 to 17, It says that he freed a woman who'd been bent over by a disabling spirit for over 18 years. So Jesus was being brought to this party, and bringing an individual who was obviously sick or in need of Jesus seemed like a smart trap. As we read in Luke chapter 11, that after that certain circumstance, they were trying to trap him, and they were trying to get him to say something that they could use against him. So I believe that this was an opportunity that the Pharisees saw as a way to trap Jesus into doing something that they could then use against him to stop him from doing his ministry. So the day was a Sabbath, and as we remember, a few weeks back when Bill McAlpine was here, he said, the Sabbath is to celebrate our relationship with God. The Sabbath is a gift from God. It shouldn't restrict activity, but it gives us an opportunity. However, in the days of Jesus, they had a very different mindset towards what the Sabbath was. For the Jewish people in that day, they treated the Sabbath as a day that was very restrictive. And they had a great deal of rules that restricted their behaviors and, in a sense, defined their day as a list of do's and don'ts. And I think the list of don'ts was much longer. Some examples of the don'ts. Fires were not to be lit. If you're cold, you can't light a fire. It had to have been lit prior. Sowing and reaping were forbidden. Food could not be cooked. You could have food being warmed, although there are very strict ways in which you could do that as well. You couldn't travel unless it was a Sabbath day's journey. So they actually developed a distance that they were allowed to walk on a Sabbath day, kind of in line with where the ark was or where their fields were in correlation to the Levite towns. So a Sabbath day's journey was about 2,000 cubits, or about 914 meters, or 1,000 yards. Healing was liable to be constructed as work as well. And that, in the absence of a life-threatening situation, the scrupulous might well find cause for offense. So unless someone was on death's bed, you were not allowed to administer first aid or to help those individuals in any way. So after Jesus being set up and noticing the challenge before him, he decides to turn the setup around, and Jesus asks his first of two questions to the Pharisees and experts in religious law that are at the party. And we read in verse 3. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in religious law, well, is it permitted in the law to heal people on the Sabbath day or not? So I think Jesus sees what is before him, and he's trying to figure out what exactly the Pharisees are up to, and he asks if it is against the law for healing on the Sabbath. The Pharisees don't answer him. We might look at the confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees regarding the Sabbath, and there were a lot of them, mostly regarding around healing. There were 7 instances where Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And we might think that Jesus was trying to get rid of or to do away with the Sabbath. But on the contrary, Jesus is challenging the kind of regulations which go against the purpose of the law, which is to bring healing and wholeness. Although Jesus broke with rabbinic traditions about the Sabbath, he did not seek to annul the observance of the Sabbath day. So why didn't the Pharisees answer? Because like the Pharisees attempting at setting up Jesus, Jesus did it right back to them. Jesus knew their traditions, their mindset, that they liked to be seen as good and honorable. So Jesus asked them a question that they could not answer and still look good. The 2 possible responses to Jesus' question. If they said yes, you could heal on the Sabbath, they would appear soft and hypocritical regarding the stringent measures they required for Sabbath observances. The Pharisees loved their rules, and they would not budge on them in any way. I can remember in my own life, a number of years ago, I was really involved with YC Alberta. And I would go up to YC every year, and I was involved with that organization that brought in a number of speakers and bands for a weekend for youth up in Edmonton. And while you were up there, you realized very quickly that there's a different level in the people that they would bring up. So there'd be individuals that they'd bring up, whether a band or a speaker, that when before and after they performed, they could walk freely amongst the 15,000 people, and it was no problem at all. There were also individuals that when they arrived at YC, they would basically lock down the entire backstage because there were individuals that were trying to get close to them, maybe pass off a CD or get into their dressing room to meet these people. And YC didn't want that to happen. So they would shut down backstage. And they would often post security in areas backstage saying, nobody, even with backstage access, is allowed back in this area. And I can remember one situation, and I can't remember who the band was, but the backstage was locked down. And within the organization of YC, I think at the time there were 4 paid staff members and about 600 volunteers. So out of the 4 paid staff members, you'd assume that they can go and do whatever they want. And the director of the organization was heading back to the change room area to talk to the band, and the security person said, "Sorry, you're not allowed back there." And he kindly walked up to the individual, grabbed his radio, and radioed the person in charge of volunteers and said, "Randy, can you please reassign?" and read the person's name. So that person did not understand why that rule was there. I can also think back a couple of years ago, one of my bosses was friends with Prime Minister Harper. And Harper would call him occasionally at the office. I have no idea why, I wasn't on those conversations, but he would call him. And one time he was in a meeting, it was just his weekly meeting with some individuals, and Harper phoned and they said, "I'm sorry, he's in a meeting right now. Can I take a message?" So after that meeting, it was made clear once again that, yeah, you may not disturb during meetings, but if the Prime Minister of Canada calls, you're allowed to come in and say, "Do you want to take this call?" See, there were rules, and you could argue that these people were just doing what they were told or asked or maybe implied. However, we need to not only know the rules, but we need to understand the heart of why they're there. The Sabbath is to celebrate our relationship with God. The Sabbath is a gift from God. It shouldn't restrict activity, but it gives us opportunity. And that is at the heart of the law. Jesus would say that doing good can never be wrong on the Sabbath. And I'm not in any way saying that rules aren't important. I understand, and we need rules within our society. But there's the time where we can become so tied to the rules that we miss the opportunities that are in front of us. Those examples I said are real, but they're ultimately not life-changing. In the first, he was slowed down a little bit from where he needed to go. And in the second, I'm assuming he was slightly embarrassed when he did talk to the prime minister. But the Pharisees were allowing their love for rules to miss out on humanity, on care, on compassion, on healing for people who are experiencing great suffering. They couldn't answer yes because the Pharisees had spent their entire life ensuring they followed the rules and judging or punishing anyone who did not adhere to their list of 613 rules. On the other hand, if they were to say no, they could be accused of being inhumane and uncaring about human suffering, which I believe they were anyways by not answering. But it is one thing for the Pharisees to condemn Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. It is a totally different thing to be responsible for denying someone in need to be healed. These rules may have been implied, but they never came. These rules may have implied this, but they never came out and said it. A couple of years ago, I was in Brentwood, and I was going to the ATM to get out some money. And I have this uncanny ability to attract individuals to me in very unique circumstances. And I often have people coming up to me that will avoid many other people. And at Brentwood, at the certain time, I was just driving in my car, and somebody approached my car, and I was talking to them, and they asked me for money. And at that time, I'd been involved with many organizations downtown working with homeless individuals. And there's kind of this rule that they told me time and time again that you don't give cash to the homeless because you're enabling, and they have all this list of rules as to, or reasons why they'd recommend not doing that. If somebody comes to you, take them out, buy them lunch, and then that way you have an opportunity for a conversation, and so on and so on. So when I was asked for money, my default answer was, "Sorry, I can't help you." And I proceeded to drive out of the parking lot. And as I got back onto the road, I was very much convicted in my heart because God said, "No, you need to give that person the money you just took out." And I was like going back and forth with God saying, "I can't. The rules are you aren't supposed to give money, blah, blah, blah." And I was going back and forth. And finally, God said, "You need to give the money." So I said, "Fine." And I turned around. I went back to the parking lot. I drove around for a few minutes. I could not find them anywhere. And I left feeling like I missed out on a great opportunity. I don't know why they needed it. I don't know what God had intended through that, but I felt very strongly that God had asked me to do that, and I missed out on that opportunity. In a sense, for me, it changed, and it gave me a new approach, that when I'm asked for things, not to stick to the rules, but to stick to God and His Spirit, and what is He challenging me to do? What is He asking me to do in this certain circumstance? And if He asks me to give money freely or whatever else, I need to be obedient to the Spirit of God and not strict to these rules. So back to our story, the Pharisees didn't respond. They couldn't respond. So Jesus turns to the man with dropsy, heals him, and sent him on his way. And that's all we hear about. In chapter 14, verse 4, it says, "When they refused to answer, Jesus touched the sick man and healed him and sent him away." When Jesus healed the man, the word that was used to describe it describe the healing means he was completely healed. Dropsy would have most likely been the symptom, as I said earlier, of a more major problem going on in his body. And when Jesus healed him, the watery fluids dissipated, his organs were healed, and the swelling disappeared. There is little written about this healing. It's just stated that he was healed and sent on his way. Being sent away could also be interpreted as an act of compassion. See, the man was, in my thinking, he was placed there as a trap, as a spectacle. And Jesus healed him and sent him on his way so that he would not have to hear the potential tirade or experience the anger of the Pharisees. Jesus was to take any anger that arrived, but he wasn't finished yet with the Pharisees. Jesus then proceeds to ask the question, a second question to bring his point home, and this is verse 5 and 6 of our passage. It says this, "Then he turned to them and asked, 'Which of you doesn't work on the Sabbath? If your son or your cow falls into a pit, don't you proceed at once to get him out?' And again, they had no answer." Jesus now makes it personal with a statement that he previously used. In Matthew 12, verses 9 to 14, Jesus is once again healing on the Sabbath and in the synagogue, so that's double bad. And Jesus asked a similar question before he healed the man. In verse 11, it says this of Matthew chapter 12. "If you had one sheep and it fell into the well in the Sabbath, wouldn't you get to work and pull it out? Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, it is right to do good on the Sabbath." And in our Luke account, there is some debate as to whether Jesus said, "If your son or cow," or if he said, "your donkey or cow." Either way, what he is communicating is that if it's something of value, i.e. a family member or part of your livelihood is in danger, and it is the Sabbath, you will do what you need to do. In a sense, what Jesus was saying is that if the Pharisees' eyes, a farm animal has a greater value than this man who is sick with dropsy. How true is this today still? Now, please hear me out. I do not believe in inhumane treatment towards animals, but I get tired and I get frustrated when in the news, in the media, we see a dog or a horse or some other animal being mistreated or neglected, and there is an uproar. I get that mistreatment of animals is wrong, and I would be okay with the uproar if it was equal to the uproar that happened when the atrocities occur towards people. Because on the other hand, there are people who are created in the image of God, being murdered, being assaulted, being sold, and being neglected every day. And unless it is a child, our culture seems to perceive that as normal, or at least there is little fuss or outcry made over it. Are we any different than the Pharisees, who based on rules ignored the needs of those around them? For us, it may not be based on rules, but we pass by, we neglect, we don't speak up for those around us all the time. And often we just say, someone else is doing that or someone else will. Or maybe it's just me that's guilty of this. I can remember in January in Harvest Hills, that's the community that I live in. Harvest Hills was a community that had Calgary's first homicide of 2014. And I'm ashamed to say that one of my responses, one of the thoughts that I had was, oh, that was probably drug-related. And the media did report it was a drug-related murder. However, what is so broken in me and in society that when crimes happen, we say, oh, it was a drug deal, or oh, it was over there, it was because they wore that. And we miss out, like the Pharisees did, that as a faith community, we are called to have empathy, compassion, and concern for our fellow mankind. There is nothing okay with murder, with violence, with abuse, with neglect, and as a community that is following after Jesus and trying to represent him to our world, we need the heart of Jesus to transform us so that we no longer have our fallen, sinful heart, but the heart of the Father that says, I will let my son die on the cross because I love and care for each and every one so much. I wish and I pray that that could be said of me, that I love and I care for each and every one so much. The reality is I still have a long way to go on this, and I still miss the bar and I make mistakes. But my desire is that that would be said of me one day. Follow Jesus, change the world. That's what we're calling this series, looking at times in Jesus' life and ministry and being challenged by who he is and what he represents so that we too can be difference makers in our world. Last August or September, we were asked if we would host the screening of the movie Sex and Money. This movie takes a very real look at the results of pornography, sexual exploitation, prostitution, and human trafficking. Not way over there in other parts of the world, but right here in our own backyard in North America. We as Christians who are being transformed into Christ-likeness need to stand up and say that is not okay, not there, and not here. If you don't believe this happens, or if you want to learn more or be part of the discussion where we get asked the question following the movie, what now? I'd encourage you to come out on Wednesday. It'll be a movie that is not easy to watch, but something that will hopefully challenge the way that we look at our world. My concern is that as a society, we become desensitized or maybe inward focused or whatever else, so that like the Pharisees, we're concerned with how something happens that we miss out on a work of the Spirit that is happening or should be happening that doesn't fit into our box. There are a lot of people in our world that need a touch from Jesus. And maybe you're here today and you're one of them, where you need a touch from Jesus. Maybe you need a healing in your own life. The same God who healed the man with dropsy 2,000 years ago is with us today, and he offers the same healing on this Sabbath. Maybe you need relationships restored. Maybe you need peace or hope in a situation that makes no sense at all. I believe that there are people here today that you need a touch from King Jesus. And I'd encourage you to allow him to minister to your heart and your spirit in whatever way he desires today. In a little bit, I'm going to give you an opportunity to come forward for prayer. And the way that we normally do it here at Harvest is that following the services, staff and elders will be up at the front, and we'll meet with whoever needs to pray. But today we're going to do it, I think, a little different, where during the last song, we're going to encourage you to come forward at that time, where you can come forward while we're singing the last song to receive prayer from our staff and elders, whether it's for healing or for whatever else that's going on in your life, or maybe you just need someone to talk to. And we'd love to take that opportunity. And it will be available following the service as well. Maybe there are people here this morning, you're being convicted that you, like the Pharisees, are preventing or hindering the work that God has been trying to do by his Spirit. And today is the day to say, God, I'm done opposing you, and I want to be a part of what you're doing or wanting to do. Confess that to God and start over saying we're not going to be tied to the rules, but we're going to be tied to your Spirit and what it is that you're calling us to be a part of. My prayer is that us as a congregation, as a church, that we'll notice the needs around us, that we'll bring those needs to Jesus, not as a trap, but out of compassion and a love that says this is not the way life is intended to be. If you see people in your workplace going through relational strife, or their marriage is falling apart, or there's trouble with their kids, don't just feel bad or pray for them on your own, but go and approach them and get involved. Pray for them in person. If you see someone at school being bullied or picked on, stand up for them and don't say that is just part of life, but be a difference maker in your school, on your campus. If you see a neighbor sick or struggling, be the hands and feet of Jesus. Help them in whatever way they need. Stand up for the homeless, the neglected, the prostitutes, the abused, the broken. Let us be the hands and feet of Jesus wherever he has placed us. There also might be people here this morning that, as we're talking about receiving a touch from Jesus, you're saying, I don't even know who this Jesus is. Or you've been getting to know him, but you've never made a decision to make him the Lord and the King of your life. We're going to give you an opportunity this morning as well. And as I pray at the end of our service, I'm going to give you an opportunity to repeat some words after me. And they're not magical words, but it's basically surrendering your life to God, saying, I've missed the ball, I've dropped the ball, I've made mistakes. I accept your forgiveness, the work on the cross. We're approaching the Easter season, which is all about Jesus coming to earth, living amongst us, dying on the cross, paying the price for each and every one of our sins so that we can be restored to relationship in Jesus Christ. If you want to make that decision today, we'll give you an opportunity, and you can follow after me as I pray in a few moments. As a congregation, let us commit to celebrating the work of the Holy Spirit wherever he moves, even if he moves in a way that doesn't fit in our box, and to also commit to not being in his way in whatever he is desiring to do.